That was lovely. Thank you.
Sorry, you're off.
Should we leave meeting or continue?
We've got this meeting is being recorded. Continue, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was nice. Thanks, everybody. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. As you may realise, we're not very good on this tech front, so please bear with us on this one. Okay, some background. We were asked to look at a site a couple of years ago by prospective purchaser as to its archaeological implications. They've been told by London Borough of Tower Hamlets that it might have something called the Whitechapel Fort on it. And A, was that true? And B, was that a problem? Well, we looked at it and we found there were two things. A, it wasn't where the Whitechapel Fort was, it was where there was another fort. And they, I think, very wisely decided not to buy the site. However, on the basis of that, we'd found a fairly substantial discrepancy between the map evidence, the documentary evidence, the archaeological evidence. We approached Historic England with a view to being sponsored to actually do some research. And very generously, Historic England sponsored a pilot study, Study Area 1, which is between Wapping and Shoreditch.
The yellow area.
On if you can see it on the screen.
Yeah, the yellow area here.
Okay, to look at that to start with. That was impressive, as I think we would agree by the time you see what our results were. So we've been sponsored then to do section 2, the green bit, which we've now just completed. And we've only heard today that in fact we've now been sponsored to do South London as well. I mean, on this slide, what I've done is I've put what had been hitherto the received wisdom as to where the defences lay, which is in black. Here is the City of London with its medieval defences, which were still functioning in the 17th century, which is major sort of power bases, which is the Tower of London here, St Paul's here, and Guildhall, which was the centre of the city government. This is the only bridge across the Thames at this point until you get about 20 miles further north, London Bridge, and here we have Southwark, the great borough of Southwark. Round the bend, so to speak, is where the politicians are at the Palace of Westminster and Westminster Abbey. So these are functioning the power bases. There were also suburbs, so there were other houses, but there was quite a lot to protect. So it ended up, you had these defences built, which were 12 miles, 18 kilometres in length, the largest in Europe, I believe, at the time. And there were 25 plus forts, one way or another, in the circuit. The problem was we were looking at this number 2 over here, which didn't seem to tally with everything else. The problem has been that no contemporary map was made of these defences. So people have depended on a map which was produced considerably later, 1738, by a chap called George Virtue. With efforts, we will try and get the slides to work now. There we go. This is Virtue's map. Now, it all looks very plausible, which it was meant to, because it's actually a fake from pretty much top to bottom. There's an enormous amount of information here which is just wrong. It wasn't known. In this mid-17th century, great substantial chunks of this area weren't built, but everybody had assumed this was accurate. The only other map that was around was a map discovered by pure chance by David Sturdy, who's always been a tremendous proponent of investigations into the Civil War defences of London. He came across this in the manuscript of Stukely's. It doesn't match with what's on the Virtue map. It's something else. So we start off looking at our original sources. Right, well, here's Virtue's map. This area, this area, this area, this area, those weren't built up in the 1640s. He was using a wrong map. He was using descriptions which were out of date, and he'd misunderstood them. The man was a serial forger. He also forged great chunks of the Agus map. He forged illustrations of various buildings on the Thames, and Guildhall and such like. And Stukely's map is in fact just a blow-up version of Holler's very, very small little sketch of the defences, which appears in the background of a part of the quartermaster's map of 1644. So the original on the Holler map from here to here is less than an inch. It's 22 millimeters. So there's no great span to it. So the two map evidences are not very good. We've got an interesting fact. We've got this Scotsman called William Lithgow, who was allowed to go around the defences as part of probably propaganda by the city, which was on the side of Parliament. As you may be able to see here, he's called a Scotchman and a liar on this manuscript, which is the British Library copy of his work. He had written several books, probably slightly exaggerating his adventures, but on our investigation suggests actually his work was very, very, very accurate in many respects. We think he exaggerated the number of cannons because it was a piece of political propaganda. But in terms of actual where the forts were, he was actually describing what he was seeing and walking past at the time. Right, I'm running out of breath now. In terms of the research, with what we've actually done up, that's having sort of discarded some of the previous research, we've found some other stuff. On the left-hand side is the Commonwealth Exchequer list, which was brought to our attention by David Flinton, who is the leading military historian for this period. And he'd been contacted by somebody who'd heard there was this project going on. I don't know if you can read this quite complex, difficult 17th century writing, but you see Gravel Lane, Whitechapel. It's basically a list of expenditure for soldiers on various forts, prisons, and other things. Very, very interesting. Great work for the historians of the future. For us, interesting, but doesn't actually help pin down the locations. Our remit has really been trying to find out where are the forts. We've come across this DeWitt map, which you can see here in 1666. Now, a very faint pencil line runs around this site on all sides here. And that, you'll see it in more detail. You don't just have to take my word for it. That is the lines of communication which joined up the various forts. The reason why they're on this plan is because they were still being used as a tax boundary into the 1680s, 1690s, as much as we might talk about inside the M25 or outside the M25, you were either inside or outside the old lines, it was put. And if you were inside, you had to pay 2 shillings a month. If you were outside, you only had to pay 1 shilling a month. So it was quite important to know where you were. So new evidence coming in. Over to Mike.
Hi, everyone. This is a LiDAR map showing, if you like, the background to the study area. We have study area 1 here and study area 2 here. North at the top, as usual, the River Thames at the bottom, there's Tower of London there. In terms of the drift geology, which, if you like, forms the basal floor to our archaeology, it's where we normally stop. We've got the Thames floodplain gravel down here covered with alluvium. We've then got the gravel terraces up here. We've got the Taplow gravel, the Hackney gravel, the Lynch Hill gravel, Boyne Hill gravel further north. And the thing about the gravel is it's very well drained. So it's quite good to work with. One's trench, one's ditch doesn't automatically flood. Now, looking at the topography, the line here between the sort of light brown and the light green is the 10-meter line. This is the 20-meter line, 30 meters and 40 meters at the top. So what it's showing is the high ground is at the north and towards the west. But when I say high ground, this is not alpine. It's all fairly flat. And in fact, the area where most of our defences are, the actual height range is just a bit over 10 meters, over about 2.5 kilometers. So that's about one in 250. So that means it's pretty flat. So the thing about the civil engineers who were building these defences is they were dealing with fairly light soils on well-drained and fairly flat ground. So that's kind of good news because it's relatively easy for them. The major topographic feature, apart from the Thames, is the River Fleet, which comes in from Highgate and Highgate Ponds up here. Two streams join together. They drain southwards, discharging into the Thames at Blackfriars Bridge just here. So we can see here that the slightly lower ground here is in actual fact the Fleet Valley. And we can see that from the New River to Southampton House, this stretch of the Section 2 defences has to traverse this topographic feature. And we'll have a look at that in a minute. So what we're going to do is we're going to start here at Wapping, and we're going to follow Lithgow in 1643, who went anti-clockwise around the defences, describing each one as he goes. We're going to do that ourselves, but with our modern research and what it's telling us. So we're going to start out here at Wapping. Over to you, Pete.
Okay, here we go. As you can see, here we are in Wapping. There is the Tower of London, just to give a focus.
The blue line at the bottom there is, we're going to put one of these maps up at the beginning of every
blue circle,
section.
so you know where you are.
Yeah, so that's where we are.
Now, hopefully you can see down through here the line of on the DeWitt map, which is the lines of communication. So up there, that's the Whitechapel Fort. Down in this area, we have got the circular area, which is sort of, I don't know, let me see if I can just move. Sorry.
Can we get rid of, you could probably move it down to here.
So
there, that's it.
We've got a bit of chunk of technology in a way. Okay, we can see our own slides now, which helps. As you see here, this oval area, that is where the lines of communication come down to, and where the archaeology is also extremely useful.
Right, I'm just going to nip back one. If we look at this red circle here, this is where the cartographic and documentary evidence suggests the Wapping Fort may well be. This is where we think it is. So this photograph is taken looking north with the River Thames about 20 meters behind us. This road here is the eastern end of Wapping High Street, and this road going north is Wapping Dock Street. Just off to the right is a little road called Cinnamon Street, and this is where in 2008 Moeller did an excavation for 2 vent shafts for the East London Line's Wapping Station. And these 2 vent shafts produced some very, very good results. They showed that archaeological survival was very good behind these buildings. It's an area that was backyard area. Archaeology had survived, including 16th, 17th century deposits. In vent shaft number 1, 2 ditches were excavated, ditch number 10 and ditch number 2. Ditch number 10 is the one that interests us. It cut ditch number 2, so it was slightly later. But the thing about this particular ditch was that it was revetted on one side with timber planking, and the alluvial fill which filled it produced material that was dated 1640 to 1660. So this is within the date range that we're looking for. It's mid 17th century. So this is kind of good news for us. In shaft number 2, a brick floor was recorded with some makeup material that was dated 1640 to 1660, and a further, the remains of brick footings for a building were also recorded, and the bricks dated 1550 to 1666. So this supports and builds our case for a fort at Wapping Station in this location, taking other lines of inquiry like the documentary and the cartographic evidence as well. So when we took this photograph, it was quite interesting because looking north up Wapping Dock Street here, there is a gentle rise northwards, as you would expect, away from the Thames. But within this gentle rise, there is a bit of a hump here. I don't know if you can see it. It's difficult to photograph these humps because they really are, they're quite low. They're not very pronounced, but they are there. And we've noticed at Mount Mill and at various other places, from the Royal London Hospital, for instance, that when large mounds, artillery batteries, rubbish dumps that have been converted to artillery batteries and so on, have been reduced in size, when they've been slighted and lowered, there's normally a residual bit at the bottom that they don't clear up sort of too well, and they produce a hump. And actually my chair thing, and the hump that we've got here, we think may be part of this Wapping Fort. So we're just hoping that this actually adds to our case for the location of the Wapping Fort. Okay, over to you, Pete.
Okay, here we are. We've now moved on to Whitechapel. As you can see, this is where the DeWitt has got a large cluster of stuff, a scribbly thing, which is the fort itself. The documentary evidence is absolutely clear that it's at the end of where the houses were. On Faithorn and Wait, it's on Newcourt, my tummy's got 1658. If you look carefully at the map, this rare map, in fact, in detail, you can see the outline of the bastions, which were actually at this fort, and it was built round the windmill as described by the Common Council and is recognised.
And doesn't the documentary evidence, I think this is Whitechapel settlement, and Lithgow says that the fort is at the end of the Whitechapel settlement where the windmill is.
Absolutely right.
So the map's pretty cool with that.
Yeah, so we've got, this is Whitechapel itself, the Whitechapel, and it's the houses there, as Mike said, and at the end of that is the defensive line of the fort itself. And that seems to survive as a property boundary, so that we've got on Roke this funny looking angle here, which looks like it's the edge of a bastion, and on Roke, on Horwood, it's still here. And over to you, Mike, on that one.
Okay, so if we look at these two strange dogleg kinks here, we're going to look at a photograph that's taken from this position just here, looking southwards down Plumbers Row from, this is what became the A11's Whitechapel Road. So here we are, here's Whitechapel Road, looking south down Plumbers Row. This is the Whitechapel Foundry, and our dogleg is down here. The photograph that's next door, I'm going to show you now, is taken from this area here. So we're now looking, Whitechapel Road's up there, so we're now looking into the Whitechapel Bell Foundry. And what we're trying to show is this line here is a bit wiggly, it's a bit of a dogleg here. So the property boundary is still respecting this rather bizarre and unusual shape. You wouldn't normally build a street like this. And in the 21st century, we've still got a property boundary which is respecting it, which is pretty good. Now, in 2019, Jeff Potter and Compass Archaeology undertook an archaeological evaluation inside this building, and which produced quite good results. They broke through the floor slab and found deposits that were dating to the 17th century. So we think the survival here is reasonably good. Now, this is only evaluation, so it's going to build up to full-scale excavation next. What it has proved is that survival in this area is good enough to merit further investigation. Rather intriguingly, this is about 4 inches long, from these dark deposits, which we think are the fill of some hitherto unknown cut feature, produced this pipe clay model, which we think is perhaps the model of a cannon. It's only about 4 inches long. This is an old penny. And if there's one person who's full of theories, it's Mr. Mills here. and he's got a theory for this as well, which he'll tell you about.
It just struck me as this was obviously sort of the main fort facing on the eastern side of the defences, that it might well have had a coat of arms of some form, probably the city sort of cross with the dagger in the corner. But around those things, often you get heraldic devices such as helmets, spears, shields, and cannons. So it struck me as it might be a highly decorative piece of stuff on the outside of the fort, and this could be possibly a fragment that comes from that. On the other hand, I've got absolutely no other evidence from that. It may not be, but it looks like a toy cannon from
dare we say it, this is not smoking gun evidence of the Civil War, but it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun. So let's go to the
cannon.
Indeed. Off we go.
Okay, right. Okay, we're now moving further out to Mile End. And here we are with Liverley Line. This is described by Lithgow as 2 petty forts at Mile End. And we know from damages paid to a chap called Phil Potts, who owned land in Mile End. He was given money for forts built on his land. He then sold his land on to a chap called Austin, hence Austin land here in orange. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look here, there is a very marked, weirdly kinky thing, which looks a bit like a bastion. Now, not definitive, as Mike said, not smoking gun stuff. Phil Potts got money. Somewhere in this orange land, there was a fort, and it does seem strange that there is a property boundary there, and to all intents and purposes, that might well be where it stood. Not definitive, but I think we've got a reasonable case on that one, on balance of evidence. Right, okay, Royal London Hospital, right. This was the original sort of troublesome site, because this site and this site supposedly were the same. As you can see, with the Whitechapel fort actually being in Whitechapel, as it was in the 17th century, you end up with a straight line all the way from Wapping to Shoreditch. In fact, the Royal London Hospital was outside, and it was further out and of a different date, I think. So Now, probably quite a lot of you are familiar with the Holler's panorama, and in the area there where the
just keep moving, it'll appear again if you move.
Yeah, Curtis keeps moving around. As you see, there's Tower of London here, and we got London Bridge. But this sort of area here, if you look in the background, there is actually a fort. Holler drew a major standalone fort with its bastions, a very substantial barrack block, flag. It's not part of the defence's line. It is something separate. And I think the date of it, the drawing of 1647 is very significant. 1647, Fairfax, at the head of the New Model Army, marched into London and took over. There had been a dispute between the city and the New Model Army. The defences were slighted, which is the term for making it militarily non-effective, not demolished, but just with no use. And suddenly this appears. And the Venetian ambassador in 1647 says that Fairfax, having slighted these defences, then is building 3 citadels to control London. And I think we've got a reasonable amount of evidence to suggest this is in fact one of the great lost citadels that Fairfax built. And the site, as we will discover, is got considerable archaeological potential. It was so big that in fact, when this is Christopher Wren did a drawing effectively for a planning application, one of the landmarks he noted was the fort, and it was a very, very large structure. On Roke, you can see this enormous mound, and this is, I think, where the problem, the confusion is. It's called the Whitechapel Mount because it lay within the parish of Whitechapel, and the Whitechapel Mount became the Whitechapel Fort by error. And you can see it's from Chatelain's drawing there. It was a truly enormous structure next to the London Hospital. The brand new London Hospital was being built at the time. Mike.
So what we're looking at here, again, we've got the A11 Whitechapel Road as was, and we have a few rows of terraced houses here. We're going to look at, well, the photograph above is taken from this area here, looking down New Road here. So there's New Road. This is the Whitechapel Road going left to right here. These terrace houses here are the Mount Street terraced housing. And what we're trying to show is that these cars here are about 1 metre higher than the pavement here, which is what we've tried to capture in this photograph here. If you look at where the car wheels are, and if you look where the pavement is, there's about 1 metre difference in height. So this is likely to be the residual base of the mount. It was reduced and levelled in 1805, and in 1819 the terraced houses were built here. So that's the topography that we can see from street level today, which supports the location of the mount and the fact that it was levelled and stuff. Now, there have actually been a number of archaeological interventions for the Royal Hospital's various developments over the last 30 years. And they have found a very confused picture. It's a similar characteristic around the edge of the mid-17th century city in that there's a lot of gravel quarrying and brick earth quarrying going on around here, which fragments the archaeological deposits and the archaeological sequence, making it extremely difficult to understand what on earth's going on. But nonetheless, Moeller and various others have recorded a number of cut features that look like they're ditches and so on and so forth, but it's very difficult to do anything with them, and we're not sure what the evidence suggests regarding the archaeology. So we have to rely on documentary evidence and on cartographic evidence to give us an impression of what's going on in this particular area. Over to you, Pete.
Okay, well, briefly, Brick Lane, next fort up the line. The description from the City Council on this one was there was a redoubt to be built betwixt Whitechapel Church and Shoreditch Church, which isn't much of a geographical location. But as it so happened, archaeological excavation has probably provided a lot of information on this one. Mike.
Well, the trajectory of the lines of communication went thus. And when we matched that with the Historic Environment Record data sets, which we screened for material that was of 17th century date that looked like there could be defensive features and so on and so forth. Not that many dots came up, but about 11 came up, which we called green, which were, there's possible significance here. And one of them was here at the Brick Lane station. The railway bridge here was built in 2007, and Mola excavated the footings for that bridge. And the excavations recorded the brick earth cap that we now know is the base of the archaeological sequence. It's on top of the gravels. On top of the brick earth cap, there was an agricultural soil. And the interesting thing about the agricultural soil was that the dating that Mola got from it seemed to suggest a date of 1630 to 1650. So once again, if we've got these forts being built in 1642, 43, we're in the right date range here. And more interestingly, a couple of linear cut features were also seen cutting this material, which seemed to be parallel with each other and seemed to be related to each other. And this is quite interesting stuff for us, because one of the features that has come up regarding the Civil War defences is that for some reason, double ditches seem to be in vogue with defending the redoubts, the smaller forts. So we're not talking about the major lines of communication or the major artillery batteries, but the redoubts, the smaller forts. And Papillon, who wrote in 1645, who was a military engineer, in a contemporary review of defensive engineering works, his military manual states, "Your great ditch being 20 foot broad is far safer than these small double ditches having a bank of earth some 2 feet broad left between them, used and erected about the London redoubts." And we're going to come across this double parallel ditch system, both at Hoxton, which is F7 up here, and also at Mount Mill over here. And we've got a couple of them here. These particular ones are about 60 centimeters wide. So as far as we're concerned, this is quite interesting.
Okay, right. So double ditches rule okay. We're on to Shoreditch now. Shoreditch, not much archaeological work's been done in the area. We've got this is the DeWitt plan again, and it's sort of a little shrubby blob of some sort there. Map evidence suggests possibly that might be the last residual memories in land holdings of the bastions, which is here on Chester. It's in that area. It's one for historic England when they're sort of obviously chasing up planning applications. This is obviously a key area to be looking at, and there's nothing been found which is sort of definitely on the archaeological side. There we are. We've got a fort, and it's somewhere in this area. Across the road, we've got the Hoxton Fort, which was actually quite substantially manned. We know from the Commonwealth Exchequer list that there was a lot of troops on this one, so it was probably more important of the two. It was almost like, as Mike would probably discuss with Mount Mill, that you have fortifications either side of the road. It looked like the same as Hyde Park as well. On that map. Yeah, we got, so this is the main road, which, as Lithgow said, is the road from Scotland, which was very important because of the Scottish ambivalence as to whose side they were going to be on. Hoxton was a major fort, and it too, in terms of its last vestiges, may have left traces, but it's also, more significantly, has got archaeological information from the area. Okay, so the major north-south route is Kingsland Road, which is here. Old Street comes in east to west at the bottom of it. Parallel to it, and a bit further to the west, is Hoxton Street, and then we've got Hoxton Square over there. The slightly earlier map here shows the same sort of configuration of roads and streets. The interesting thing is the backyard areas here and here, because what actually happened up to the present is that the buildings tend to front the main roads. So behind the yards behind these buildings tended to be left open, and what that means is that archaeological survival is better, is quite good in these areas. And again, Mola undertook excavations on a road called Drysdale Road, which runs across here, this area here. And in 1999, at 35 Drysdale Road, they discovered and recorded 4 pits, each one about 1.5 meters in diameter. So that's quite a big pit.
filled with domestic debris, including oyster shell, animal bone, ash, charcoal, pottery sherds, etc., etc. Now, the interesting thing about these pits is that 3 of the 4, fourth one they weren't able to date it, but 3 of the 4 dated to 1640 to 1660. So once again, it's within our target date range. So as far as we're concerned, that's quite interesting. Also, a brick-walled cellar with a gravel floor was recorded nearby, and the type of bricks used in its construction indicated a date in the 1600s. A couple of years later, in 2001, Moeller went back there and excavated 7 to 27 Drysdale Street. And here they found 2 parallel ditches, number 12 and 14, cutting the truncated natural. One of the ditches was dated to 1580 to 1650. It was about 2.4 meters wide and 1 meter deep. The other ditch was smaller. It was 1.2 meters wide and half a meter deep. Unfortunately, no finds were present. But just to the south of that ditch, another pit was recorded, and the fill of this pit had material dated 1630 to 1650 in it. So once again, this is within our target date range. And the thing about the domestic characteristics of these fills is that if you have a guardhouse and if people are staying there for any period of time, one of the things we would expect is for, in actual fact, some of the material evidence to be domestic in nature, because people were staying there, they were eating, drinking, and so on. So we find this information quite exciting because this is where we would expect to find the twin fort. Okay.
Okay, on we go. Mount Mill, heading west. Now, this was a mighty fort, a curious history, Agus map. So this is, more than the best part of 100 years earlier. And you can see this enormous mound here. Basically, it was a garbage dump that rubbish was taken up here from London to the city, and it was just dumped here and dumped and dumped and dumped, to the point some entrepreneur built a windmill. I don't know if you can see this little windmill on the top there. That windmill blew over. It was briefly replaced by a chapel. That was then demolished. Then it was replaced by another windmill, and then the Civil War broke out. And then it was requisitioned and became a very important part of the defences. So having got a large lump of soil sticking out, it then had sort of perimeters of defences put around it, as you can see, with some pretty ferocious looking defences to stop assaults with loads and loads of cannons. And intriguingly, it also had clearly a wider area around it with at least 1 redoubt there. Lithgow mentions 3 redoubts. So it's basically looking almost like a medieval castle. We've got the main tower and then a bailey with towers around it. So quite substantial elements. And archaeologically, that has come in with some very interesting work over the years.
So here we are at Sebastian Street, which is 150 meters to the north of the main artillery bastion at Mount Mill. And we are on the western side of Goswell Road, the A1 major road leading to Islington. Again, major arterial route in and out of London. And we have 2 parallel ditches. And this photograph shows 1 ditch here and another ditch here. The darker material being the ditch fill, this being the London clay, which is sort of light brown color. So once again, we've got the double ditch situation. And we think that this may be protecting the Goswell Road with a twin fort to the other side. Now, this particular shot shows a section through the ditch with the brick earth at that side, about 1 meter wide. They're quite deep, they're flat bottomed, steep sided. Now, the dating evidence from these ditches dates them bang to the middle of the 17th century. So these are datable to the Civil War pretty much. And they are parallel with Goswell Road. And we have this planking at the bottom. This was species ID'd as oak. And this is quite interesting because when Lithgow in 1643 gave his description of the defences, he says, "The portholes are sided with timber and the platforms where the cannon lie are laid with strong oaken planks. Okay, this is not an artillery platform, it's the bottom of the ditch, but we have some strong oaken planks here. So as far as we're concerned, these are some of the best Civil War defensive ditches that we have found to date. Now, on the other side of Goswell Road, a couple of years earlier at the King Street estate, Mola discovered some other ditches. These were also of mid 17th century date. They weren't parallel ditches, but they were quite big, and one of them had wood residues on one side, and they dated to the Civil War period. So what we think is happening here is that we have two redoubts, two defensive structures, one either side of Goswell Road. Over to you.
Just as a note here, it's been suggested in the past, looking at Roke's central London map, that these lumps are possibly remnants of the redoubts. Looking at an earlier version of the large-scale map, in fact, you can see these are just open ground. These are rubbish dumps. These are not part of the defences. Part of what we've been finding is also not finding new things, but getting rid of old ideas, as it were. Okay. New Riverhead. Now, this was built in 1613 to supply as a reservoir of the New River to provide fresh, clean water for the City of London. It also then comes 1643, provided a very convenient large structure which could be fortified to provide defences for London and also protect a very important strategic asset. It's described in the city instructions for building a fort as building a fort at Islington Pound. Virtue, when he was doing his phony map, took that to mean the animal pound at Islington Green. Valuable, I'm sure, as the pigs and cows were, that wasn't the idea. In fact, in the 17th century, the word pound and pond were interchangeable, and it was the pond that was being protected, and it's the pond here, as you can see. Go back to the cartoon that we've just been talking about with Mount Mill in the corner. There it is. That's the reservoir. That's its overspill reservoir. These are parts of the defences, water and water. So this is actually a very important part of London's defences because it actually meant there was drinking water coming through. Back to Holler's panorama. Again, just behind here, top of this hill, we zoom in and there we are. There is the reservoir. This is called the water tower, the water house. Over here is a little building, and that is the actual circular of the reservoir itself. Holler, again drawing, he was basically a semi-royalist spy. He draws a timber structure here with basically timber breastwork, which is what Morgan shows here is this diamond-shaped bastion. So over here we've got Mount Mill. The lines of communication went across here, across Woods Close, and leading to this fort, which then provided a very high level of protection. This is one of the few forts which are still visible in modern London. So that is the line of the reservoir. So if you stand here on Rosebery Avenue, the Angel's just up there, look here, you can actually see part of the rebuilt elements of one of the Civil War forts, which is quite fun. Okay, then following the route of Lithgow, we shoot up to the Angel, which is the highest ground overlooking this area. It's 40 meters, 130 feet above sea level. Holler again draws that, and you can see a massive fort here with enormous bastions and a cross of St. George and a little flag and a huge barrack blocks there. It's big enough to be shown on DeWitt's map as a quadrate fort. And on this ground, over to Mike again on the archaeology.
Right, going through to the 18th century now, looking at these two views. Pentonville Road is in the foreground, here and here, probably Amwell Street going down there. This is the Riverhead here to the south. St. Paul's in the distance. Now, from this particular vantage point, you could probably take out St. Paul's with a good cannoneer. So it shows you the height and the vantage that this particular major fort offered. And also you've got the major strategic asset of the water supply here. But in actual fact, we're going to go on a slight tangent here. There is a chap fishing there, which I quite like. But here next to him, there are some more lumps and bumps. And if you look here, the lumps and bumps have gone. They've cleared them out. Now, these may be the remains of banks and ramparts and defensive structures where the upcast has been piled up. The upcast is mainly composed of brick earth that has been dirted. And the thing about this is that redeposited dirty brick earth fires bricks better than clean brick earth and is a major asset for anyone who commercially wants to produce bricks. So when we see that this ground is now flat compared to this ground, we can see there are two brick kilns on the site as well. And one of the things that David Flintham has mentioned is that perhaps we should start thinking about what is the relationship between late 17th, 18th century brick kilns and their locations with respect to the Civil War defensive mounds.
An interesting point is that, just to finish up on this one, that two different pieces of leaseholding land plans, if you lay them one over the other, it does appear that we might even have the vestiges of the northeast bastion of the fort still present into the late 18th, early 19th century. So that's quite fun. In fact, even though it's long gone, land ownership in English law is extremely persistent. Okay, Gray's Inn Lane. A small fort, Papillon, who Mike was talking about, dismisses it as a small square redoubt of little interest. It was near where the Pindar Wakefield, so when Lithgow was walking through here, he'd obviously stopped for a pint or two at the Pindar, and he called it the Pindar Wakefield Fort. There's nothing significant in terms of the mapping, but from a topographical point of view, Mike has got a few words.
Yeah, this is Roke's plan. They're both Roke in actual fact, but this drawing's a little more crude than this one, but they both show, using the shading quite nicely, the topography of the Fleet Valley. Here's the River Fleet, basically coming north-south, if you like. This is Gray's Inn Road here, Gray's Inn Road here. Here again, this is the Fleet coming southwards here. Now, from excavations over the last 30 years have been undertaken in this area by Mola and also by Archaeology Southeast, and they produced some interesting results. But the main thing that showed up is the waterlogged nature of the valley bottom where the Fleet goes through, and also environmental samples taken by Mola have shown, you know, the suite of wetland plants you get in this area. So we're looking at very marshy, boggy wetland area at the bottom of the Fleet Valley here. So in actual fact, in terms of the defences of London, the circuit would not have needed to defend this particular bit of the Fleet Valley. There's no way you would have got an army through there anyway. But the defenders would have probably liked to have been able to cross this area. And Roke's maps, okay, they're 100 years later than the Civil War, but there are two crossings. There's one there at Black Mary's Hole, and there's one here at Mount Pleasant, where they've obviously sort of bridged the stream, the river. What we don't know, unfortunately, is how they managed to do it within the circuit. Neither do we know exactly where the circuit went in this particular area. The numerous excavations that have been done around here showed that there are deposits of mid-17th century date. They show there's been a lot of quarrying, which has fragmented the archaeology. They show there's been a lot of dumping in the late 17th and early 18th century, filling in the valley bottom prior to the development of this area, prior to the urban sprawl over into this area. But at the moment, we're struggling to say much more about it than that. What I'm trying to show with this photograph is the topography, and we've got Rosebery Avenue at the top there, and this is Phoenix Place and Ray Street at the bottom. So what we're looking at up here is the eastern flank of the Fleet Valley, and the drop goes from about just over 20 meters OD to about 10 meters OD. So you're looking at a drop of about 10 meters, which is not precipitous by any means, but it's fairly shallow. But it's not inconsiderable when you are trying to defend put a defensive circuit around London and you've got boggy, marshy areas at the bottom. The River Fleet would have flowed just behind where this photograph is taken. And indeed, another stream would have come in and joined the Fleet pretty much where this crossroads is, which was providing water for Lamb's Conduit. So it gives you an idea of the up and downiness of this area, of the difficulty of the terrain here. And we really need to do some more archaeological investigation here to really work out what on earth is going on. Right, over to you, Pete.
Okay, this is a rare instance where the lines of communication have actually been recorded. This 17th century drawings by the Danes family, when the Southampton was having his estates drawn. You can see here there are parts of the lines that have been done on a separate map. There's the fort of Southampton House has also been drawn, and this is the line that goes out, and that is the approximate position of Gray's Inn Fort. It's just intriguing. They've worked themselves round a piece of very marshy ground. I mean, this was published by Rosemary Weinstein. It's an excellent article she produced. I say very unusual because most of the lines disappeared apart from that sketch line on DeWitt's map, but it gives us an idea of how it was working. And sort of finally, the big ones is Southampton House, which this map of Moore in 1662 actually shows the moat around the bastions. On the Commonwealth Exchequer list, it's referred to as the East Bastion and the West Bastion, and each had about 20 men on. So they were quite seriously armed to place this. A proper fort, the sort of one that actually, as David Flinton, looks like a properly designed military structure. The other ones look like it's people who'd heard about military structures. And it survived. This is the original document here. It's been redrawn. As you can see, it's very fine, sort of classic piece of Civil War architecture, which most of the London defences don't have. And by the late 17th century, it turned into gardens for the Southampton family. And indeed, it survived right into the 19th century. So sort of 1799, it's still there. It was only really cleared in 1800 when Russell Square was laid out. And there is a view of from the north looking south, which is fairly unusual for what it looked like before it was gone. Just very quickly touching, and there were some other smaller forts which we've looked at, which is St Pancras, Holloway Road, Stoke Newington, and Dalston. They're basically place names, but they could be there somewhere. Not going to take too much time up tonight because obviously we're running short of time. So we're kind of getting back to reviewing where we'd got to. As you can see, the sort of black line was where it was thought the defences were, and the red line is where the evidence now suggests they are. So it's radically different, which explains why when Mike and I were digging holes, sort of say in this area, we weren't finding the Civil War defences because they weren't there. So this is a sort of massive rewrite on the terms of the archaeological alignment of these things, because it totally and utterly changes where we should be focused, because the point of this exercise is not just academic, it's also to provide a very finely tuned planning tool for historic England when assessing planning applications within the London area. So this is not just an academic research, this is immensely practical to try and gear that where developments are happening in the areas, they will be properly considered as to what's going on. Sort of just to quickly try to highlight, this is sort of like the forward bits. We've done, this is study area 1, the yellow one, study area 2, the green one. Literally today we got the okay from study area 3, which is brilliantly being jointly funded by Southwark and Lambeth Archaeological Excavation Committee and by Historic England, who are looking at this very, very important area that's housed there. It's going to be a real handful. Mike's mainly been looking at the archaeology. So thanks to somebody called Harvey Sheldon, who's dug about 7 million holes in that area, we've got our work cut out trying to find out what's been found down there in the past. But I suppose that's kind of on the slides. I don't know if we should then now go to...
We need to thank everybody.
We need to thank everybody and anybody.
David Flinton has provided
unstinting
historical military advice to us all the way through this, pretty much. So much thanks, David. Well, I think we know you're looking. So.
And it's also obviously thanks to all the guys in sort of Historic England and Glass, one way or another. And Place Services have been working with us on working out the sort of impact assessments and
we
survival
we
assessment.
wouldn't have got where we are without the unstinting work of all sorts of archaeological contractors, through from Mola through to Archaeology Southeast and PCA and so on.
It's very generous.
Who have undertaken the field work and have provided us with their assessment report. So to you all, thank you very much. I think we're there.
I think we're there.
I think you're there. I think
All right,
that's
you
brilliant.
are still, we didn't know if you were there still looking or not.
We were definitely looking. I was just hiding my gaze from you. Thank you very much for that. That was fantastic. The combination of the documentary research, the cartographic, I mean, that's just amazing to see. So thank you very much. And I have to admit that while you were showing all those interesting photos, I'm afraid it's in my mind to book you for a Lammas Lake walk in the summer. I will be reinstated. Well, I'm sure there's a watering hole somewhere nearby. I'm sure we can check the place name. So I will be coming back.
Okay.
Now, if people have questions, if you can type those into the Q&A box. There's a couple of messages that have come into the chat. Taryn has asked whether you'll be publishing. So you might mention what you've done and what you will be doing on that front.
Yeah, I mean, on the publishing front, I mean, the idea was primarily to provide a research tool for Historic England, not to produce a nice book. We are well aware that the problem with books, by the time they're published, they're out of date. So we've been looking at something which we discussed with Sandy Kidd, that's in charge of glass, that something that would be totally flexible and interactive, that as excavations proceed, it's updated. This isn't a fixed document. This is to be constantly updated and added to, so that in a sense, a publication would be self-defeating. This is meant to be organic. Ghastly phrase, but you know what I mean. It shouldn't be sort of set in aspect. Some of our stuff will probably be shown to be inaccurate or downright wrong. We don't know. At the moment, all the documentary evidence is heading this way.
It's fairly nebulous at the moment. We haven't discussed exactly what sort of format and if it would be published, but what we initially thought of was we would have a cloud-based data set that we would produce that would provide this information, that as new discoveries came in, they would augment it, and so it would grow.
I think it's safe to add that Mariah Medlicott of Place Surfaces has been happily digitising the results of Pete and Mike's findings from the last phase, and we'll be doing work on the next project, the Vauxhall to Rotherhithe section. Those data will be uploaded onto the London Historic Environment Record, which apparently really is soon going to be going live. So you will be able to see that from your homes at some point, I believe, in the next few months. So data will be available like that. Mike and Pete have completely failed to mention that they published something in the London Archaeologist recently. So I can't remember.
Andy isn't an echo.
It's the one before the last one, isn't it? So to those of you that get the London Archaeologist, there are data in there. But the next phase of the project is quite a big one. So it's going to be a little while, but information will be available. And it's probably something that would be good to drop onto the Layers of London website as well. So
yes, indeed.
that answers the questions about publishing and books and so on. There is a question, and I think you touched on this, but you might need to make it a little bit clearer. Simon Morris has said, you've shown the forts, what joined them up?
The lines of communication joined the forts up, which is a bone of contention as to what their format is. We have got ideas about what their defensive characteristics were like, which Peter will touch upon now.
Yeah, I mean, basically the lines of communication in all the contemporary documents are always referred to as trenches. And I think the thing is that they've been thought of in the past as maybe a ditch and bank, rather like an enormous version of Maiden Castle all the way around London. certainly the bits that Lithgow, when he's tromping around, he invented a verb. He was trenching here and trenching there. And the soldiers are being told to get into the trenches, and people are complaining in Parliament, why aren't men in the trenches? So it wasn't a ditch, it was a trench. And as Mike said before, with the idea of the oak planks and the oak revetting, it is certainly in this area, the areas we've looked at, it looks very much, it would look something like a First World War trench, that's something that had timber holding up the sides, probably quite soggy on the bottom of various places. Undoubtedly, as you push further round towards Westminster into South London, if you dig a ditch, you're digging a canal. You're not actually digging a trench at all. So there's got to be a point where it becomes a lump of ground sticking out with possibly something on top, possibly palisade.
And its defensive feature was the rampart, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was effectively.
And where was the rampart? Was it, which side was the rampart?
Well,
Is an interesting.
I think it was more. It's what it said on the tin. It's a line of communication. It was a military term. It's to get troops from one fort to another without having their heads blown off, preferably. So it was not a place where you stood and fought. It was a stuff you skedaddled from one fort to another as quickly as possible.
So the rampart would face the enemy.
That's right.
It would be outside the ditch, not inside the ditch.
That's right. Yeah. So as far as we go on that one, we're not military historians. Our line is, where are the forts? Where are the lines? Somebody else can dig them all up, because we're too old and ugly to do any hard work like that anymore. But the reality is, the morphology, I think, is actually in our area.
Some of these rampart designs that David Flinterman and his colleagues have come up with are incredibly complicated and incredibly detailed.
Yeah, so
you wouldn't believe.
The archaeology will find all on that one. So there we go. Fraser's answer.
That's great, because you've also answered Mark Wheeler's question as well, who was asking about the trenching and the oak base planks. So that, I think, has answered that one. There are lots of comments saying how very interesting they found it all. We have Rachel English has said how useful it will be to have a layer in GIS which gets updated. Rachel, that is indeed the aim. We want to have on the London HER a GIS layer which shows the polygons of what has actually been found and what Pete and Mike have unpicked. And yeah, ideally that through the new Arches system should go live online later this year. So we're optimistic, and as has been mentioned, that's going to be used for planning, not just for Glass, because the next section will look at Southwark. So hopefully that will be a useful tool for Chris Constable over in the Southwark department over there. Lots and lots of best wishes and compliments in the chat. David has mentioned, of course, the strength of the defences within the forts. And those are all the questions that I have. And as we have a minute and a half to go of our scheduled time, Lucy Whittingham has confirmed that the article was in the London Archaeologist Winter 2021 edition, volume 16, number 3. So if you want to read a little bit more, then do flick through your London Archaeologist. And if you're not a subscriber to the London Archaeologist, then it is remarkably good value and well worth subscribing to. I think we will stop there with comments on tonight, other than again to thank Pete and Mike very much for the talk, for the project. And we'll look forward to nailing them to do a little walk for us around some of the northern extent, and we'll look forward to hearing more about the next phase of the project, which commissioned today. So thanks again to Slike for part funding that, along with Historic England. So I think it just remains for us to say, Karen, next lecture.
Next lecture, yes, our next lecture is on the 12th of April. And it will be Danny Harrison is going to be talking about the ice house at Park Crescent West. So it's a standing building that was recorded by Mola, where they found a fantastic 18th century ice house. So do tune into that one.
Brilliant. So in that case, final thanks to Pete and Mike. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I think everyone seems to have found it really interesting. So thanks for that. Watch this space and do come to our next events. So I'll say good night to everyone.
Thank you very much indeed.
Cheerio.
Bye.
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 Hang on. Don't wait to see if anybody's